Workers are staging protests nationwide on this International Workers' Day, also known as May Day. But this year, they are driven by mounting frustrations over the coronavirus response. The pandemic has put nearly 20% of U.S. workers out of jobs, and with no income, nearly a third of U.S. renters didn't pay their rent the first week of April. And then there are the essential workers on the front lines of this pandemic who are risking their own lives just by showing up for work every day. NBC News business and technology correspondent Joe Linkent joins me from a rent strike outside City Hall in Los Angeles. And Joe, it sounds pretty loud where you are. Tell us what it's like there.
Hey, Allison, you can really feel the tension here outside City Hall here in Los Angeles. This started as a rent strike where people were driving in their cars saying, we don't want to pay rent because we can no longer afford it. But it has quickly evolved. From that rent strike, you can see over here a large gathering of pro-Trump supporters and pro-reopen protesters took to the steps of City Hall. It's been largely peaceful so far, but moments after they got organized here, a group of anti-fascist groups here came over and added their signs to the fray. The police quickly had to step in here to keep the two groups of people apart. Obviously, two sides of the political spectrum here, but we want to show you that as much as we are trying to observe social distancing here, that is definitely not what's happening here in downtown LA. Now, we haven't really seen much violence, which is the good news, but a lot of tension, and there's been a lot of economic tension that's been unfolding here. You can feel it. People without jobs, people asking for rent and mortgage cancellations, and you can see the reopening group is a lot larger here with those American flags and the pro-Trump flags, a lot of them protesting the ongoing statewide stay-at-home order by Governor Newsom, as well as the policies here set into place by Mayor Eric Garcetti. But the tension here you see is largely in control, but you definitely have two sides of a big economic story here trying to get their voices heard, and they certainly do not agree, Allison.
Yeah, Joe, we know this is just one example of several protests going on today and probably throughout the weekend. We know workers at a handful of the major retail companies are protesting today. What are they specifically asking for?
Yeah, you're hearing about stick-outs and walkouts of some protesters who are working at these big online retailers and brick-and-mortar stores, Walmart, Target, Instacart, even FedEx. And these companies have responded to that protest, and they are all saying that we are providing more safety equipment, PPE, for our workers. But the workers say, no, you are not. We need more. This is a pandemic. We do not feel safe at work. Now, we don't have a count on how many people have participated in those protests across the country, but this is part of a series that we've seen, an ongoing theme, that workers on the front line of retail are not necessarily happy or satisfied as their companies perform really well, handling all of that demand from all of us who are doing shopping and buying those essentials, Allison.
Yeah, Joe. Joe Linkent in L.A. at a May Day protest there, a tense one at that. Joe, thank you so very much, and please stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.